I used to have a PowerPoint for this next session, but I kind of changed it up a little bit just to do something a little different. So I'm going to kind of speak more from the lectern here at this time. But we do want to talk about sexual intimacy in marriage. And, I think about, you just have to kind of bear with me here. I know I'm kind of corny in some of this, but, we've talked about marriage being like a car. Getting in our car, driving down the road, and sometimes we have, accidents, and sometimes, we get frustrated, or we don't know what direction to turn, and we got to make sure we look at the guidebook and all of that. And so the analogy can go on and on, right? We got to know the rules of the road, as we talked about last night. But sometimes we get in the car, and sometimes we just kind of like to, pull over. And we like to maybe take a blanket and go out in the woods and, lay down on the blanket and things that develop after that when you're married, right? Supposed to be funny, but anyway, okay. And, but as we're doing that, sometimes maybe things don't go as well as we'd, like for them to go. And so our desire in the marriage relationship with regard to sexual intimacy is that I think we would all like to have those mountaintop experiences. And if you know what I mean, right? We don't want it to be just purely physical, but the physical part of it is absolutely awesome. So the desire to meet the needs that God has given us and do it in a way that is appropriate, but in a way that is also satisfying and enjoyable and really is spiritual, is something that eludes people sometimes in couples. And we have found that couples sometimes have difficulty in this area. And I think probably all of us could admit that at times maybe the sexual intimacy part of our relationship has been better at times than others. I find a little bit of humor in all of this because in talking to couples, they may get a little bit worried about, well, how specific are we going to get? Especially we've got single men in here today. Well, I can tell you we're not going to get that specific, but we do want to maybe help you with some things that might help you to grow and to develop in this area. It does remind me of Carla one time being asked to speak at a lectureship on the topic, and she's back there going, what are you about to say? She's probably worried back there. But at a lectureship, she was asked to speak on to the ladies, of course, on the topic of from the living room to the bedroom, sexual intimacy in marriage. And so she and I were talking about it, and she said, I don't know. I'm just not sure I can feel comfortable about handling that subject, and what do I do? And she was asking, and I said, well, I don't know what to tell you, but I'll be glad to help you with the research, is what I told her. She laughed about that, and she told everybody, well, it does sort of, I think, speak to the fact that sometimes, and I don't want to stereotype or overgeneralize, that sometimes I think, men may be more interested in this than others, although that, again, don't want to overgeneralize in any way, but it does speak to the fact that there's a lot of differences. So I also want to share this with you before I give you some practical things to think about, and that is that just because you're older doesn't mean that it can't be better or that you can't enjoy it. Another little funny thing here before I give you some real practical things. Carla and I were doing a marriage seminar in San Marcos, Texas, and they had rented a retreat center, and there were several, mainly it was all younger couples. It was their kind of young adult group that had got together and decided they wanted to have a marriage retreat, and the elders said, sure, that's great. So Carla and I went out and spent a lovely weekend with these probably about 12 young adult couples. So they're sitting, they had a nice conference center, they're sitting in a big U and had their tables out, and they're all taking notes. And it was really a great, great weekend. And well, in the middle of that conference, and I'm speaking, Carla gets a text from one of our boys, and who's married, has a great family, and says, hey, what are y'all doing? And Carla just snaps a picture and sends it back to him and says, we're in the middle of a marriage seminar. Well, my nephew was at that marriage seminar. And so my son, you know how they are, he sees him and he zeroes in on him. You know, he expands the picture and then he crops it and he sends it, blows it up, and sends it back to us and to Josh, my nephew. And Josh just happened to be sitting there like this. Okay. And then my son's caption was, that moment in the seminar when your aunt and uncle talk about sex and and marriage, you know. It says it makes you want to throw up in your mouth, right? Well, I don't want to make some of you younger couples, throw up in your mouth, as it were, here. But sex isn't just great when you're younger. It is awesome when you get older. And it can be that way. But a lot of us don't experience that because we don't spend the time in working at it and thinking about how wonderful it can be. So I want to talk just a little bit about maybe how to encourage us in this area. And as we do, there are two major things I want us to think about today. Number one, I want us to know God's intent. I'm going to focus and center around the word know, to know God's intent. And then number two, know your spouse. Now that's pretty simple, isn't it? But let's expand on that. Know God's intent and then know your spouse. Let's talk about God's intent. To kind of help motivate us and encourage us, we have to see it from God's perspective. It's hard to believe that some might need a little motivation in this area, but the reality is that some do. For various reasons, maybe it's physiological, maybe it's bad experiences, maybe that just something has happened emotionally in the relationship. Sometimes circumstances in life can curb our desire in these areas. So as a result of that, sometimes people become unhappy or frustrated. So what can we do to get motivated, to encourage us to work at this? Because it is something that certainly demands work, certainly demands effort. It doesn't just come naturally. And I think that maybe we, particularly men, maybe think of it that way. It's a natural thing. I'm just going to be involved and have sex, and yet there's much more to it than just the physiological part of that. And so when we think about God's intent, here's the subpoint of this. There's 2 or 3 subpoints under this. It's God's intent for us to know, or that we need to know God's intent about it. And when we do that, we need to know that, number one, sex is God's super glue. It's God's super glue, right? You experiment with super glue, right? You touch something, and I can't get my finger off. I mean, it stays. Super glue, when you really, especially the Gorilla super glue, right? Some of that stuff, you can't hardly get it apart. It intends to hold you together. God designed the sexual part of a relationship to be his super glue. In Matthew 19:9, verses 1 through 6, we read, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and he shall be joined to his wife, and they two shall become one flesh." Now, I do think that there is an implication of the one flesh being a reference to the sexual relationship, but I think it's much more than that. The oneness that holds us together comes as the result of many things in life, whether it is the trials that we face or just the memories that we create, the families that we have, and the things that we get to do together, and so forth. There's a lot there that can make us one, where there is this unity. And sex is one of those things that God has created to help make us one. Sex is a highly spiritual activity. It's important for us to know that. God created it. He designed it. And so it has spiritual implications because he said from the beginning, he has made male and female that they two might be one flesh. And so if sex is involved in helping us to become one flesh, it's a spiritual activity. Sadly, many of us don't always think of it that way because of what the world has done to make it terrible, nasty, or profane, or something that is simply totally sensual. And yet God designed it. There's something interesting that happens when we have sex. We have been created with these sort of natural hormones in our body that are emitted at several kinds of things going on in our life. When we exert ourselves, when we do certain things, or when something exciting happens, like the birth of a child, there is a particular endorphin released. One of them is called oxytocin, okay? And when that endorphin is released, when there's something exciting happens, what happens is that it sort of embeds in our mind a bonding experience. Recently, in Israel, of all places, I read an article that had been done and associated with how that there is a natural bonding that takes place between a mother and her child at birth, because there is this happiness, this euphoria, this excitement, and the child senses it, and there's sort of this bonding that happens as a result of it. But they also were showing that not only can it happen between mom and child, but between father and child as well. And that's why it's important, especially in those early years, for the father to be present in the life of their children, because they can bond as a result of this chemical being released from the pleasure hormone that happens. Well, when sex occurs, there is this oxytocin that is released. And what it does is sex stimulates the release of that. And so what happens then is that it can bind you together even through sort of a chemical process. So it's not just simply a physical thing, but there's a chemical thing that's happening in us. So that bonding is what I call God's superglue. Sex was a way that God intended for us to bond together emotionally because of those experiences. So that's number one, and why sex is important in the marriage relationship. Okay? Happiness and trust ends up being burned into our mind by the release of those hormones. And because that happens, that's why it's so important to realize that when you violate that, then trust is broken. And it's hard for someone to feel a sense of connectedness to someone who has ripped that apart from the relationship. Now, we're going to talk about tomorrow briefly in our lesson on love about how you can come to love each other again, even though adultery has been present in the relationship. So number one, knowing God's intent is to know physiologically that it's his superglue. Number two, we need to know that God intended it for pleasure. Not simply for procreation, but God intended it for pleasure. We are made with a drive for sexual pleasure. God intends for us to enjoy life and to enjoy the sexual relationship. Hebrews 13:4 says, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed is undefiled. Genesis 1:31 says, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. That meant the sexual relationship was involved in that. The way our body was designed and the sensitivities and the physiological components of it all were created by God. And they seem to have some of those physiological elements and the sensitivities that we have seem to have been designed for the express purpose of enjoyment. Okay? No other value can be attached to it than that of pure physiological and psychological pleasure. When we read passages like Proverbs 5:18 through 19, drink water from your own cistern, let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe, let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Do you hear those words? Delight, intoxicated, rejoice. Those are all things that say to us, God intended for this to be a holy, beautiful part of the marriage relationship. When we see God's intent for the sexual relationship to be satisfying and delightful, it begins to change our perspective. Have you read the Song of Solomon lately? Wow, that's pretty powerful stuff, especially chapter 4 and onward is an account of a husband and wife who are very much in love and who are very much enamored with the sensual delights, notice this, of one another's body. They're enamored with the sensual delights of one another's body and the physical encounters that they have. The language of the Song of Solomon is steeped in agricultural terms and imagery. And sex is compared to the sweetness of a garden and the fruits of the vineyard that are refreshing and greatly to be enjoyed. We delight in certain vegetables, Rob delights in those jalapeno peppers that he grows. And so I don't know what that says about he and Martha, but anyway, he delights. We all think certain vegetables and fruits. Well, God uses this imagery to say sex is a delightful thing. Sometimes couples maybe look upon their spouse and say, well, he's just a nymphomaniac because he's wanting sex all the time. Well, we understand that desires can get out of control and people can be ruled by it and they can become addicted to it. I understand that. But the fact that your husband wants to have sex and wants to have it regularly doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. It means that they have a desire that God has given to them, and it certainly always needs to be spiritual and always confined to the right way. All right, hang on, I'm getting a little dizzy here. I haven't been bending my knees. Okay. All right, so it's in these agricultural terms. Reading the book inspired by God will tell you how sensual and pleasurable and delectable the sexual relationship is and what God intended. All right, we're going to come back to that in just a moment. Know that God's intent for sexual activity was to provide a better quality of life for us. So he designed it for our beneficial health. By the way, the word know, when I say that know God's intent, that's very interesting. I want you to hold on to that. We're going to come back to that in a second. What does that mean to know God's intent and to know our spouse? But for now, the third part of knowing God's intent is knowing that it is good for us physiologically. So number one, try to stress, it's God's super glue. Number two, God intended it for pleasure. Number three, God intended it for a beneficial purpose, for our good health. Now, I read something not long ago in a medical magazine online, and here was the title of the article. You ready for this? 10 surprising health benefits of sex. The perks of sex extend well beyond the bedroom. And here was the essence of the article. Okay? It eases stress. It improves sleep. It lessens the chance of prostate cancer. It lowers heart attack risk. It counts as exercise, which I'm just glad to know about that on my app. Right, that we used to. Lowers blood pressure, improves women's bladder control, boost your libido. They call it libido. Helps keep your immune system humming. I've even tried to convince Carla that it also helps with keeping our hair from turning gray and is great for the common cold, but she wasn't going to buy that one, okay? So there's a lot of health benefits associated with a sexual relationship. The point is, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. God knew what he was doing, and so there's a lot of joy and blessings that come from it. So know God's intent. Then, finally, not only do we need to know God's intent, but we need to know our spouse. Now, the word know, K-N-O-W, found in Hebrews 13:4, says that the marriage bed is undefiled, right? Whoremongers and adulterers God will judge, but the bed is undefiled. Now, that's the way the King James translation translated, maybe some others. And the word bed there is a euphemism. Now, sometimes there are good euphemisms and sometimes they're bad euphemisms. A euphemism is just a word that means less harsh. Less harsh. And we all understand that sometimes people can use euphemisms and it sounds like a curse word and we need to avoid those and so forth. I get that. But sometimes a euphemism can be used even in the medical field, right? Someone passed away. That's a euphemism. Instead of saying, well, their heart stopped or they're dead, right? We say they passed away, okay? So when someone goes to the bathroom, that's a euphemism. We don't describe what's going on in there. It's a euphemism. It's less harsh. Well, the word bed is sort of a euphemism because it comes from a Greek word that our English word coitus comes from. And it just quite literally means sexual relations or sexual intercourse. Now, I remember reading in Genesis 4, verse 1. Several times in Scripture, the Bible uses the word know to refer to the sexual relationship. About 17 times, in fact, out of the 900 times that this Hebrew word is used, 17 times it is specifically referring to the sexual relationship. And when I first read that, I thought, God's just using, or the translators are using a euphemism there. They're just making it less harsh. They're not trying to say, okay, here's what, really is going on. We're going to say that Adam knew his wife. But the more I thought about that, the more I realized it's not a euphemism. It's exactly what God intended. Adam knew his wife. Now, isn't it interesting, and we'll talk more about that in just a second, about what that means, that the Bible describes the sexual relationship as knowing one another. How does the world typically define the sexual relationship? What word do we use for that? The word intercourse. Sounds like, somebody who is transportation director invented that word or something, right? I mean, it sounds like a transportation word, intercourse. God says the sexual relationship is defined as knowing. Knowing. Sure, there is a physiological aspect to it. But even in the physiological aspect to it, as you read in the Song of Solomon, realize that Solomon knew his wife. He knew pretty much everything about her because he took time to observe, to learn, to understand what her needs were. It's a beautiful thing to know that this word know in knowing each other means that we, first of all, know the difference between male and female. Again, I don't want to overgeneralize or stereotype, but the reality is that we're different. We are different. There are certain needs that we as men have and certain needs that women may have. And again, not that there can't be a crossover, but there's been a lot of research and study and just through experience and wisdom and reading books and what people have written about this from a good faith-based perspective is to know that there are differences. Sometimes those differences can be categorized, without overgeneralizing, in this way. That men can typically be more visually oriented, while women may tend to be more touch oriented and connected emotionally. That doesn't mean that, again, I'm not to say that one is better or less and stronger. I'm just saying that sometimes a man, if he's not careful, can just make this a physical act. But what we've read and studied is that a lot of women don't see it in just that way. Now they can, but there's an emotional attachment, right? You've probably all heard unfortunately the guy that's husband and wife are, having problems, and the man goes, "Hey, just come to bed and we'll make it all better." And she's like, "This ain't happening." Why? Because there's a difference. A man may tend to think, well, this, because so much joy and excitement can come from it, that this is how I'll make it better. And she's like, "No, this is not." There's a huge difference. There's a difference sometimes in the way that even maybe male or female, but sometimes even within the two, that sex can be stimulated, or that we can arise to an interest. You probably remember the song. I can't remember the artist, but who said, that men turn on like a light bulb and women warm up like an iron. You ever heard that, And there's some truth to that. There are differences between sexes and differences between people about what might interest us sexually. And so understand that there are different desires. So first, know the differences between male and female. I would also say that for a man to want to have sex and have it a lot doesn't mean that he's perverted or he's depraved. Or if a woman needs her husband to just hold her and to hold her hand for a while and to talk to her before they make love doesn't mean that she's cold and frigid. God made us different. And the Song of Solomon speaks to some of those differences and those needs and those attractions. See the Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verse 1, where Solomon spends time talking to her. We both have physical and emotional needs. What are they? How are our needs different? We need to spend time talking about it. The desire to eat, the desire for shelter, the desire for safety, and self-esteem are all a part of what Maslow's hierarchy of needs describe, the sociologist, but there is also that need that we have for sex, but don't forget those other needs. The need of affirmation, the need for self-esteem, the need to be loved and feel safe. We all have those needs. And so a lot of times before we can reach the apex of the sexual relationship, we've got to make sure those needs down here are being met. The need for intellectual intimacy, the need for emotional intimacy, physiological intimacy before we even get to the part of truly knowing each other on a sexual level. So, know the differences between male and female, but secondly, know the unique needs of your spouse. 1 Peter 3:7 says, "Husbands, dwell with your wives according to knowledge, giving honor unto them as unto the weaker vessel." Now the word weaker there and weaker vessel, in my study of that, doesn't mean, of course, that she is weaker intellectually, that she's weaker in terms of even so many areas right of life. But there is a difference physiologically between men and women. I mean, I don't ever think in my lifetime I'll ever see it, maybe never, that we'll ever see women playing in the NFL football league, right? There's just, generally speaking, a physiological difference in terms of strength between a man and a woman. Men, you need to be aware of that. You need to be aware of the fact that you need to dwell with her according to knowledge, and that sometimes she can be fearful, and you need to create an environment of security and safety. I know, Carla's heard some of these stories 1,000 times, but just talk about them, but they're effective. And I remember one time when Carla and I were first married, and we were watching TV, and anyway, she was sitting on the couch, and I was kind of down, sitting on the floor, lying, and we were kind of, doing the giddy young married stuff, kind of poking each other and all that, and which you still need to do, by the way. And so, but I remember I'd kind of forgotten and got engrossed in what we were watching, and she reached down and she thumped me. And, my reaction was, because I grew up with a brother that used to pick on me, was I kind of did that, Like a while ago, the guy that said this, but a little different anyway. So I did that, and well, she got very angry at me. I was like, well, you hit me. Why are you angry? I didn't understand. But then I began, as we talked, realize it scared her, because she realized how much stronger and bigger than I was than her. And even though she knows now, especially, that I would never hurt her, there was still that psychologically that was different, that there needed to be a feeling of security. And so men, just as Solomon wrote, we need to tap into that and to understand the insecurities that are there. Have you ever read Solomon chapter 1? And again, we as men have insecurities as well. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying, know your spouse and know the things that they are insecure about and the struggles that they face. Solomon, the first chapter of the Song of Solomon, does anybody remember how she describes herself? What she says about herself, the Shulamite woman? She's dark, right? It's not a reference to her race. It's a reference to her, which we think differently in our world today, right? We think, okay, no, man, we want to tan our body and whatever. But for a woman in Solomon's day to be darkened by the sun outside meant her skin was kind of leathery. Okay? And she says, don't look upon me like this or in these other ways. And if you read the whole context, it seems as though she has some insecurities about the fact that Solomon as a king is going to encounter other women, especially if he's out shepherding somewhere and there were these places where maybe sometimes women who were prostitutes might gather and come and entice the shepherds or someone out of the way. And so she was worried about how she looked compared to those other women out there, and how that he might be tempted to look upon them. And so instead of her working out in the fields and what she was doing with her hands, and she just felt that insecurity. We need to understand that, men, about our wives, especially on the issue of pornography. Pornography is sinful, it's wrong. But when we break through into that area and we may participate in that, we need to understand the impact of not only the relationship between us and God about that, but between us and our wife. How that affects her. All that they have to constantly think about in this world. They're constantly being compared to models, and the same thing for men, that are being projected on magazines, and that those models themselves don't even live up to, right? As we said last night, they've been airbrushed and everything's just right and all that. They don't look that way. And yet that's what we're bombarded by in society constantly, are these images of what a beautiful woman looks like or what a handsome man looks like. So we all have insecurities. And what Solomon does is understand his wife's insecurities. I would say from both perspectives, men and women need to understand their husband's insecurities. So what does he do? In chapter 4, he understands that before he enjoys the delightful garden of the sexual, of it consummating in what the world says is intercourse, long before he's gotten to that point, he has complimented her from the head down. Look at the agricultural terms that he uses in chapter 4 as he speaks about her hair falling down around her neck like a flock of goats coming down from the mountain. We think, why did she like that? Because, if a farmer in that day and age, or, someone, a herdsman, he saw this flock of goats coming down. It was visual imagery that he's using to describe how beautiful her hair was when it came down around her neck. And then when he says that her teeth are shorn like white, like sheep, was it? Like a flock of shorn sheep. Yeah, thank you. What's he saying about her? He's smiling. I mean, you don't see someone's teeth and then either when they're mad or they're smiling, right? She's obviously smiling here. Why is she smiling? He's talked about her eyes, talked about her hair, right? He's probably complimented her. I love you. You're my wife. So notice that he is addressing the insecurities that he has, that she might have, complimenting those things that are great and wonderful about her. Okay? Every woman is different. No woman looks like the other. Everybody has things that, that really drew you to your spouse, maybe physiologically, certainly in terms of ethics and virtues that they possess. But be sure that you do that you communicate those things to your spouse and that you address that. What type of touch do they like? Do you really know your spouse in terms of the things that they enjoy? What is it that you could wear? Or, guys, if your wife asks you to brush your teeth, brush your teeth. That's not a big deal, right? Okay? But some of us are so insensitive. We take it personally if our wife says, I'd really like for you to take a shower. Well, what's wrong with me? I took a shower, yesterday. What's wrong with it? Maybe it's just been 2 or 3 hours that you took a shower. She wants you to take a shower? Take a shower. Why do we become so insensitive to those kinds of things that are important to our spouse? What is it that maybe they like you to wear? What atmosphere? Is it that your spouse likes music? Maybe candles? Maybe you're not in, it's candles. Well, I don't. Are you dwelling with your spouse according to knowledge? Are you thinking about the things that they like? And the only way you're going to know that is to be a better communicator. That's why we spent time talking about it. If you read the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, chapter 1, 2, and then also 2:6, you'll see that she has, even before the marriage ceremony, has daydreamed about what's going on or what's going to happen. She's thought about this. She's thought about how he might embrace her and hold her. Okay? Again, there's nothing wrong with her thinking about, I'm excited about that. I can't wait till we can enjoy this relationship. And she's thought about that. So what does that say? Each of us have maybe some thought processes about how we would like the sexual intimacy to occur. Are we willing to hear about it and to talk about it? And so that we make sure that we are meeting those particular daydreams or thoughts that we may have. Philippians 2, verses 1 through 5. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. We can't be self-centered. It's got to be about pleasing each other. Number 3, spend time by knowing them physically. Know them emotionally, know their needs, know their desires, but then spend time knowing them physically. Take a look at the Song of Solomon again. In chapter 5, verse 10 through chapter 7, verse 11, here's a man that knows his wife. He knows what she finds pleasure in. He knows what she looks like. He spent time examining her body. And then number 4, know that they will not always meet your expectations. Your spouse will not always meet your expectations. You will not always have the very mountaintop experience. And it's unfair to have that standard placed upon your spouse to say it's always got to be this way, and if we don't reach this apex, then what's going on here? Realize that we're human. We have to apply the rules and the principles that we've talked about here: forbearance and long-suffering and forgiveness and patience. We need to show grace always. Sometimes your spouse won't get it exactly right. Sometimes the timing might be off. You're not going to necessarily hit a home run every time. Know that you're going to make mistakes, and you need to be forgiving and patient and continue to communicate and work at it. Before I conclude, there are some books that I want to suggest to you that you might think about reading. And here are 3 that I think you'll find very helpful. The Act of Marriage, it's an older one, but it's called the Beauty of Sexual Love. And there's a couple of chapters in there, well, there's several chapters, but one in there that says what lovemaking means to a man and what lovemaking means to a woman. And you say, well, I'm 50 years old. I already know about the birds and the bees, right? Well, you may not have fully understood some things that may be difficult for your spouse to articulate. And this book is helpful. Now, be careful that you don't use that book as the manual to say, okay, well, here's what this wife was saying to her husband that she needed, and so therefore I need to do this, and everything will be great. Well, her, needs and his needs or whatever may be different than what's in there. But it gives you a basis for kind of thinking about, from a faith-based perspective, how we ought to approach this and to get better at it. Here's a book written by a medical doctor called Intended for Pleasure. And these are things that I think you can find helpful that are written in a very, again, appropriate and careful way. Denny Petrillo's commentary on the book of the Song of Solomon is excellent. Of course, Brother Petrillo at Bear Valley. Here's one that I thought was interesting, and it's called the Book of Romance, again, kind of based on the book of the Song of Solomon. There's a chapter in there that says, men, be a Conan and not a barbarian. I'm sorry. Don't be a Conan, be a Solomon. Don't be a Conan the barbarian, but be a Solomon. Some of us just rush into sex. Some of us don't think about it like we should. And Solomon speaks about how to approach this. And I'm going to tell you, God will reward us. It can be a spiritual moment. It can be filled with so much enjoyment, but also a spiritual glue that binds you together. Now, as we end, I wanted to mention something to you. A few years ago, Carla and I started out to live a little healthier lifestyle. I know by being around me, you probably can't tell that, right? Or the things I eat sometimes and so forth. But both of us used to be pretty heavy. And so we decided we need to lose some weight and to try to just be healthier overall. So we started walking and visiting some parks in Texas and going on some walks and hiking. We even bought bicycles not long ago. And even though it looks I look like a pig on a tricycle, but still I'm on a bicycle, and there I am, and we're trying to do this. Well, as we did it, we found ourselves getting healthier and getting out more. And as a result, we got to some places that we never had visited before. Because we just thought, there's no way, right? If I'm not healthy enough, I can't reach the apex of that mountain up there. Now, all of this isn't to say, okay, all of you got to start a diet today. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is that, by way of analogy, that before we did not know about certain wonderful mountaintop vistas and beautiful places because we didn't put the work into it to figure out how to get up there, right, and to see it. What I'm saying about the sexual relationship is that some of us haven't always experienced the mountaintop experiences because we haven't learned enough about what God wants us to do. We haven't read and studied enough. We haven't put the work and effort in terms of communicating. And as a result, we don't always find those wonderful experiences and find this sort of, place where this plateau of reaching excitement and happiness in this area. So how do we change this? How do we have fulfilled sexual lives? It involves our willingness to get out of our comfort zone, to work at it, to have some difficult or uncomfortable conversations, right? But when we have those uncomfortable conversations that may be a little embarrassing to us at first, when we do that and we put in the work, the payoffs are huge. And we will be rewarded with those mountaintop experiences. May God help us in this area that He created to be enjoyed. All right, let's, shall we have a prayer, thanksgiving for the food, and David, okay, Bob, go ahead.